The remote felt a mile away. Julian Vance saw his daughter's small face, a perfect mirror of her mother's, turned toward the television screen. Her brow was furrowed in confusion, her blue eyes wide and questioning. The news anchor's voice, smooth and practiced, was a serpent coiling in the silent, cavernous living room. It was a voice that had haunted his sleep for 6 agonizing months. "Daddy, why is the news reporter saying your name, but calling you the suspect?" Lily's voice was a tiny, innocent pinprick against the vast, cold emptiness of the house. He lunged. The fine wool of his suit trousers stretched as he dove across the polished oak floor, his hand closing around the cool plastic of the remote. He mashed the power button, plunging the room into an abrupt, ringing silence. The anchor's face, etched with professional gravity, vanished into a black, reflective void. In it, he saw a distorted image of himself, a broken man on his knees. He didn't want her to hear that word. Suspect. It was a poison, a stain that had seeped into every corner of his life, tainting the air he breathed, the food he ate, the bed where he failed to find rest. It clung to him like the scent of smoke after a fire, a constant reminder of the day the world had crumbled, both literally and figuratively. The Vance Tower, his greatest architectural achievement, his legacy, had become his tombstone. "It's just a silly word they use, sweet pea," he managed, his voice rough. He pushed himself up, trying to assemble a smile from the shattered pieces of his composure. The smile felt like a mask made of glass, fragile and sharp. "It's a game for grown-ups. It doesn't mean anything." Lily considered this, her head tilted. At 6 years old, she understood truth and lies with a clarity that adults had long since forgotten. She knew the tremor in his voice. She saw the fear that flickered behind his eyes before he could hide it. She had seen it every day since the day Mommy didn't come home. He knelt before her, smoothing the hair back from her forehead. It was the same silken, chestnut hair as Amelia's. Everything about this child was a beautiful, painful echo of the woman he had lost. "How about we forget the silly television? We need to get out of this house." The house had once been a home, filled with Amelia's laughter and the scent of the lemon groves she tended in the conservatory. Now, it was a museum of grief. Every room held a ghost. Every shadow seemed to whisper his failure. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on them both. He needed to get her out. He needed to find a place where the air wasn't so thick with memory, a place where she could just be a child for an hour, and he could pretend he wasn't the man the world was watching, waiting for him to fall. He thought of the park, but the open space felt too exposed, too vulnerable to the whispers and pointing fingers he now saw everywhere. Then, an idea surfaced, faint and distant. The public library. It was quiet. It was anonymous. It was a place filled with stories that were not his own. Meanwhile, across town, in a small apartment that smelled of old paper and brewing tea, Clara May was tracing the spine of a book. The world outside could be loud and chaotic, but within the walls of the library where she worked, and within the pages of the stories she loved, there was a gentle, ordered peace. It was a peace she tried to build for her younger brother, Leo. Leo sat at their small kitchen table, a halo of morning light illuminating his focused expression. His world was one of colors and shapes. Words were difficult for him, since the fire that had taken their parents home, though thankfully not their lives. Leo had retreated into a fortress of silence. He spoke only with his crayons, his drawings of vibrant, emotional language that only Clara had learned to fully understand. She placed a cup of warm milk beside his elbow, careful not to disturb the sweep of his arm as he shaded a brilliant yellow sun. He was drawing a lion, fierce and golden, with a mane like a firework explosion. He drew lions when he felt brave. "It's a beautiful lion, Leo," she said softly, her voice a familiar melody in their quiet world. He glanced up at her, his dark eyes offering a flicker of a smile before returning to his work. He didn't need to speak for her to know he was happy. Their communication existed in these shared silences, in the gentle touch of her hand on his shoulder, in the pictures he created for her. She was his guardian, his translator, his safe harbor. And he, in his silent, steady way, was hers. Their life was simple, a stark contrast to the opulence of Julian Vance's empty mansion. Their wealth was not in bank accounts, but in the towering stacks of borrowed books that filled every corner of their apartment, in the warmth of their shared routines, in the unspoken bond that held their small, fractured family together. Today, like most days, their destination was the library. It was their sanctuary. The grand entrance of the Oakhaven Public Library was imposing, with marble columns and sweeping arches that spoke of a bygone era. To Julian, it felt like entering a cathedral. The hushed reverence of the space was a balm to his frayed nerves. The air smelled of wood polish and aging paper, a scent of history and permanence that stood in stark contrast to the precariousness of his own life. Lily's small hand was tight in his. She looked up at the vaulted ceilings, her expression one of awe. For a moment, the worry was gone from her face, replaced by simple wonder. A small, fragile tendril of relief unfurled in Julian's chest. This was the right place. He led her toward the children's section, a vibrant corner of the vast building painted in cheerful primary colors. Books were splayed open on low tables, and soft, oversized cushions were scattered on a brightly colored rug. A few other children were there with their parents, their soft chatter a gentle hum in the background. No one looked at him twice. Here, he was not the suspect, he was just a father. Lily's father. He let go of her hand, giving her a gentle nudge. Go on, sweet pea. Find a story. She hesitated, her gaze clinging to him. The world had become a frightening place for her, too. He was her only anchor, and she was afraid to drift too far. He gave her another reassuring nod, and she finally took a tentative step toward a shelf filled with picture books, her small fingers trailing along their colorful spines. Julian found a chair in the corner, one that offered a clear view of Lily but kept him slightly apart from the other parents. He picked up a book at random, its weight unfamiliar in his hands. He hadn't read for pleasure in months. His world had narrowed to legal documents, engineering reports, and the relentless, scrolling headlines on his phone. He opened the book, but the words were just black marks on a page. His focus remained on his daughter. Lily moved with a quiet, somber grace that was unusual for a child her age. She was a ghost in her own childhood. She pulled a book from the shelf, but didn't open it. Instead, she wandered over to a small round table where a boy was sitting, his back to them. He was completely absorbed in his drawing, his small body hunched over a large sheet of paper, a rainbow of crayons scattered around him. Julian watched, his protective instincts on high alert. He started to rise, ready to intervene if needed, but then he stopped. There was something about the scene that held him in place. Lily wasn't trying to interrupt the boy. She was just watching, her head tilted, her expression unreadable. The boy was Leo. He was drawing a sky. It wasn't a simple blue sky with a yellow sun. It was a swirling vortex of orange, pink, and gold, a sunset so vibrant it seemed to pulse with life on the page. In the center of the glorious chaos, a single, tiny bird was in flight, its wings outstretched. Lily took a half-step closer. She had seen so much gray in her life recently. The gray suits of the lawyers, the gray walls of her home, the gray sadness in her father's eyes. This explosion of color was mesmerizing. Leo must have sensed her presence. He paused, his brown crayon hovering over the paper. Slowly, he turned his head. He looked at Lily, his expression serious, his dark eyes taking in her pale face and the sad little book clutched in her hands. He didn't smile, but there was no fear or annoyance in his gaze. It was a look of pure, uncomplicated curiosity. He then looked down at his drawing, then back at her. He seemed to make a decision. Without a word, he picked up a bright blue crayon from his collection. He held it out to her. It was not a question. It was an offering. A simple, silent invitation to share his world of color. From his chair, Julian watched the exchange, his breath caught in his throat. He saw his daughter, who had been retreating further into herself with each passing day, take a hesitant step forward. He saw her small hand reach out and gently take the crayon from the boy's fingers. She didn't say thank you. The boy didn't seem to expect it. Lily sat down in the small chair opposite him. She looked at the vast, empty space on her side of the paper. Then, with the blue crayon, she began to draw. She drew a small, simple house with a crooked door and a puff of smoke coming from the chimney. It was the first thing Julian had seen her create in months. A voice, soft and apologetic, broke the spell. "Oh, I am so sorry. Leo, you shouldn't bother the other children. Julian looked up to see a young woman hurrying toward the table. She had warm, kind eyes and a dusting of freckles across her nose. She knelt by the boy, Leo, and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. This was Clara. He's no bother at all, Julian said, his voice sounding rusty to his own ears. He stood up, walking toward them. My daughter. She hasn't wanted to draw in a long time. Clara looked from the boy to the girl, and then at the shared drawing between them. A house under a vibrant sunset. A silent conversation was taking place on the page. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. She looked up at Julian, and her smile was not one of pity. It was one of genuine warmth, a small pocket of sunlight in the dim, quiet library. I'm Clara, and this is my brother, Leo, she said. He doesn't talk much, but he's a great listener. Julian, he replied, extending a hand before he could think better of it. And this is Lily. Her hand was warm in his, a brief, startling connection. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was meeting someone who didn't already know his name, who didn't look at him and see a headline. In her eyes, he was just Lily's father. The thought was a profound relief. The first crack in his armor had appeared, not from a forceful blow, but from the gentle offering of a blue crayon. The library became their unlikely sanctuary. Twice a week, Julian found himself driving to the grand old building, the journey feeling less like an escape and more like a pilgrimage. He would watch as Lily and Leo found their familiar table, their silent friendship blooming across sheets of paper. They built entire worlds with wax and pulp, worlds with soaring castles and friendly dragons, worlds where the sun was always shining. Clara was always there. She would sit with them sometimes, adding a flourish of green for grass or a swirl of white for a cloud, her presence as gentle and unobtrusive as the rustle of turning pages. Other times, she would sit with Julian, their conversation quiet and careful, navigating the unspoken territory of their separate sorrows. He learned that she worked part-time, cataloging new acquisitions. He learned that she and Leo lived alone, that she was his whole world. She spoke of Leo's silence not as a lack, but as a different kind of language, one she was privileged to understand. There was a resilience in her, a quiet strength that Julian found himself admiring. She had built a life of warmth and safety for her brother from very little. She never asked about his life, about why his eyes were always so haunted, or why he dressed in somber, expensive suits that seemed out of place in a children's library. She didn't ask about Lily's mother. Her acceptance was a gift, a quiet space where he didn't have to be Julian Vance, the suspected architect. He could just be Julian. One Tuesday, a storm broke over the city, the rain lashing against the library's tall, arched windows. The sky grew dark, and the cozy interior glowed with a warm, inviting light. Julian had lost track of time, watching Lily laugh as Leo drew a caricature of a grumpy librarian, his silent humor surprisingly sharp. It was the first time he had heard his daughter's genuine, unrestrained laughter in over 6 months. The sound was like a forgotten song, and it made his heart ache with a strange mix of joy and grief. The closing bell chimed, its soft tones signaling the end of their refuge. As they gathered their things, Julian noticed Clara pulling thin jackets over their shoulders. They were clearly unprepared for the sudden downpour. He saw them brace themselves to walk out into the cold, wet evening. An impulse, foreign and insistent, rose in him. "Let me give you a ride," he said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "It's no trouble. You'll be soaked before you get to the bus stop." Clara hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She was cautious, protective of Leo. But then she looked at Lily, who was now holding Leo's hand, and her expression softened. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." His car, a large, dark sedan, felt like an intrusion parked outside the gentle library. Inside, it was silent and smelled of leather. It was another piece of his old life, a life of boardrooms and client meetings. The children piled into the back, their quiet chatter filling the space. As he drove through the rain-slicked streets, he glanced at Clara in the passenger seat. She was looking out the window, her breath fogging the glass. He could feel the quiet humility of her life, the bus stops in the rain, the thin jackets. It was a world away from his own, and yet, sitting here beside her, it felt more real than his cavernous, empty house. On the way to her address, he passed a small cafe, its windows steamy and glowing with a buttery light. The Cozy Cup, the sign read. Another impulse struck him, bolder this time. Are you hungry? He asked. I mean, would you let me buy you dinner? Or at least some hot chocolate? To thank you for being so kind to Lily. Clara turned to look at him, surprised. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of pride against the simple, honest desire for a warm drink on a cold night. He saw her glance into the back seat, where Lily and Leo were now whispering, their heads close together. We would love some hot chocolate, she said, her voice soft, her smile genuine. The cafe was small and warm, smelling of coffee and cinnamon. They found a booth in the corner, a little pocket of privacy away from the few other patrons. The children were delighted, their eyes wide at the promise of whipped cream and chocolate shavings. As they waited for their drinks, a comfortable silence settled between them. It wasn't the heavy, grief-laden silence of Julian's house, but a light, peaceful quiet. He watched as Clara helped Leo out of his damp jacket, her movements full of an easy, practiced tenderness. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a longing, perhaps, for this simple, uncomplicated warmth. The hot chocolates arrived in large, cheerful mugs. Lily gasped with delight at the mountain of whipped cream on hers. She scooped up a spoonful and, for the first time, her face broke into a wide, joyful grin. She looked like her mother. The thought was still a knife twist, but for the first time, the blade was edged with sweetness, not just pain. Lily talks about Leo all the time. Julian found himself saying, the confession surprising him. She looks forward to seeing him. To seeing you both. Clara's gaze was soft as she watched the children. Leo draws pictures of Lily. He draws her with wings. I think he sees her as some kind of fairy. They talked. It was easy, effortless. They talked about favorite books, about the funny things the children did, about the changing seasons. They didn't talk about the towering, invisible walls around Julian's life. Here, in this warm, steamy cafe, those walls seemed to melt away, leaving just a man and a woman and two children sharing a small moment of happiness. He learned that she dreamed of opening a small children's bookstore one day, a place with a reading nook and a resident cat. He saw the passion in her eyes as she described it, the way her hands moved as if she were already stacking the shelves. He felt a flicker of his own past self, the young architect who dreamed of shaping skylines, before that dream had turned into a nightmare. You'd be good at that, he said, and he meant it. You have a way of making spaces feel safe. Her smile was a little sad, a little knowing. We all need a safe space, don't we? Her words hung in the air between them. It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the shadows. He didn't answer, but she seemed to understand. She didn't press. She just offered him a small, empathetic nod, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. In that quiet moment of shared vulnerability, over lukewarm hot chocolate in a forgotten corner of the city, Julian felt a shift deep within him. It was the feeling of a frozen river beginning to thaw. It was terrifying, and it was hopeful. The cafe became their ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after the library, they would retreat to their corner booth at the Cozy Cup. It became the anchor of Julian's week, a small island of warmth and normalcy in a sea of legal battles and public scrutiny. The four of them settled into an easy rhythm, a quiet dance of companionship. Clara and Leo began to visit the mansion on weekends. The first time she stepped into the grand, cold foyer, Julian saw his home through her eyes. He saw the intimidating scale, the formal furniture draped in dust cloths, the profound, echoing silence. It wasn't a home, it was a mausoleum. He felt a hot flush of shame. But Clara didn't seem intimidated. She looked around with a thoughtful expression, her gaze soft. It has good bones, she said, as if seeing a future the house had forgotten. It just needs some light let in. And she, along with Leo, was the light. They filled the silent rooms with the scent of freshly baked cookies from a recipe she brought. Leo's colorful drawings began to appear on the vast, empty refrigerator door, a splash of life against the cold stainless steel. Lily's laughter, once so rare, began to echo in the hallways. Julian found himself changing. He started leaving his study, where he usually buried himself in legal papers, to join them. He sat on the floor and helped Lily and Leo build elaborate Lego towers. He listened as Clara read stories aloud, her voice weaving magic into the still air. He was learning to be present again, not just as a grieving widower, but as a father, as a man. One rainy Saturday afternoon, they were all in the living room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on their faces. Lily and Leo were asleep on a pile of cushions, their small bodies curled together like puppies. The sight was so peaceful, so right, that it made Julian's chest ache. He was sitting in an armchair, and Clara was on the rug, leaning against the sofa, a book open in her lap. The storm outside seemed a world away. The peace in the room was so profound, so fragile, that Julian felt a sudden, desperate need to be honest. He couldn't let her keep seeing this edited version of him. He couldn't keep hiding behind the fragile walls of their shared sanctuary. "The news reports what they say about me," he began, his voice low, breaking the comfortable silence. Clara looked up, her expression patient, waiting. She didn't flinch. She just closed her book and gave him her full attention. "The Vance Tower, it was my design," he said, the words tasting like ash. "My masterpiece. Amelia, my wife, she had an office on the top floor. She loved the view. She said it was like living in the clouds." He paused, the memory a fresh wave of pain. He looked into the fire, its flames dancing and consuming the wood. The day it collapsed, she was there. I was supposed to meet her for lunch. I was running late. He finally looked at Clara. He expected to see a flicker of doubt, of accusation. He saw only a deep, unwavering compassion that stole his breath. "They say it was a design flaw, that I cut corners on the structural supports to save money. My business partner, the man who handled the financials, he disappeared the day after the collapse. He left behind a paper trail that points directly to me. They think I sacrificed safety for profit, and that my wife, that she paid the price." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. "But it's not true, Clara. I would have never. I loved that building. But I loved her more. I would have torn it down with my bare hands if I thought for a second it wasn't safe." He finally ran out of words, the confession leaving him empty and exposed. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of the rain. Clara moved from the floor to sit on the ottoman in front of his chair. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his. Her touch was not one of pity, but of solidarity. "I know," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor. "I never for one moment believed you were capable of such a thing. I see the way you look at Lily. I see the man who helps my brother build Lego castles and listens to him even when he doesn't speak. That is not the man they describe on the television." Her simple, absolute faith was more powerful than any legal argument, more soothing than any medication. It was a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. He felt the tension he had been carrying for months begin to release, the great, crushing weight on his shoulders lifting, just a little. He didn't realize that one of the children was awake. Leo had stirred, his dark eyes open and watching them. He had heard the pain in Julian's voice, had seen the tears. He quietly slipped off the cushions and padded over to the small table where his drawing supplies were kept. A few minutes later, he returned. He stood before Julian and Clara, holding up a piece of paper. Julian took it from his small hands. It was a drawing of 4 figures. A tall man, a woman with kind eyes, a little girl, and a small boy. They were all holding hands. Above them, Leo had drawn a large, sturdy building. It wasn't a skyscraper reaching for the clouds. It was a house, with a warm, welcoming light shining from the windows. And across the roof, in a child's careful, wobbly letters, he had written a single word: home. Julian looked at the drawing, at the 4 of them united under one roof, and he felt a profound, seismic shift within his soul. This was what he had been missing. Not just his wife, not just his reputation, but this. The simple, powerful feeling of belonging. The quiet, unspoken promise of a family. The fragile peace they had built was shattered on a Tuesday. It happened at a school fundraising gala for Lily's Academy, a lavish event Julian had been dreading but felt obligated to attend. He had hoped they could slip in and out unnoticed, but the moment he walked into the opulent ballroom with Lily at his side, he felt the familiar chill. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The whispers followed them like a cold draft. He was standing by the silent auction tables, trying to shield Lily from the curious, pitying stares, when a new report flashed onto the large screens scattered around the room. It was a special investigation, a sensationalized piece designed for maximum impact. And the centerpiece was a new, damning interview. It was his former partner, Richard, speaking from an undisclosed location. His face was a mask of calculated sorrow as he spoke of Julian's reckless ambition and criminal negligence. He painted a picture of a man so obsessed with legacy and profit that he ignored all warnings. It was a masterclass in betrayal, a web of carefully constructed lies presented as a grieving friend's tragic confession. The room fell silent. Every eye was on the screens, then on him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, a physical force pressing him down. He saw the parents of Lily's classmates pulling their children a little closer, their faces hardening with suspicion. He grabbed Lily's hand, his only thought to get her out of there. "Come on, sweet pea. It's time to go." Her face was pale and confused, sensing the sudden hostility in the room. As he turned to leave, he saw them. Clara and Leo had just arrived. She had volunteered to help at the book donation table, wanting to support the school. She was wearing a simple blue dress, and she looked beautiful and completely out of place in this nest of vipers. She saw him, her face breaking into a warm smile before she registered the frozen tableau of the room, the hostile stares, his panicked expression. Her smile faltered. Julian's heart seized with a cold, terrifying clarity. He saw what they were seeing. The nurturing librarian from the poor side of town, suddenly attached to the disgraced, wealthy architect. He heard the whispers that would start, the speculation. They would tarnish her, too. They would pull her and her innocent brother into his vortex of shame and scandal. The thought was unbearable. He couldn't protect himself, but he had to protect them. He walked right past her, his gaze fixed on the exit. He didn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. He just brushed by, pulling Lily behind him, leaving Clara standing alone in the middle of the suddenly silent ballroom, a question mark in her warm, confused eyes. The next day, the dam of his composure broke. He reverted to the man he had been 6 months ago, cold, distant, and barricaded behind impenetrable walls. He called Clara, his voice clipped and formal, the voice he used with his lawyers. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to come over for a while," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass in his mouth. "Lily has a lot of schoolwork to catch up on. We're going to be very busy." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, could imagine the hurt and confusion on her face. "Julian? Is everything all right? Did something happen at the gala?" "Everything is fine," he lied, the word a bitter irony. "It's just not a good time. I'll call you." He hung up before she could reply, before his resolve could crumble. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of his study window, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was for the best, he told himself. He was cutting them loose before his sinking ship pulled them under, too. It was the only honorable thing to do. It was the cruelest thing he had ever done. Clara was devastated. The abruptness of it, the coldness in his voice, it didn't make sense. She replayed their last few weeks in her mind, searching for a misstep, a wrong word. Had she presumed too much? Had she overstepped some invisible boundary? The withdrawal felt like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and confused. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe in the quiet family they were becoming. Now, the silence from his end was deafening. The true casualty, however, was Lily. She didn't understand the sudden absence of her best friend and the kind woman who read her stories. "Is Leo mad at me?" she asked her father, her small face clouded with worry. "Is Clara sick?" Julian's excuses grew thinner and thinner. The light that had returned to his daughter's eyes began to dim again. She stopped drawing. She grew quiet and withdrawn, a sad little ghost haunting the silent mansion once more. He was protecting them, he kept telling himself, but he was destroying his own child in the process. He was destroying himself. A week later, a small, flat package arrived by courier. It was addressed to him in Clara's neat, familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, no accusation. There was only a single sheet of drawing paper. It was from Leo. The drawing was stark and simple. On the left side of the page, Leo had drawn a tall, dark tower, crumbling at the edges. It was gray and black, drawn with heavy, angry crayon strokes. Inside the tower, visible through a single, small, barred window was a stick figure of a man, alone. Julian. On the right side of the page, the world was full of color. 3 figures stood on a patch of bright green grass under a yellow sun. A woman, a little girl, and a small boy. Clara, Lily, and Leo. And in their hands, they were holding a large, golden lantern. A powerful beam of light shot out from the lantern, cutting across the page, aimed directly at the small, barred window of the lonely tower. Julian stared at the drawing, and the carefully constructed walls of his self-imposed prison shattered into a million pieces. He saw it all with a blinding, painful clarity. He wasn't protecting them by pushing them away. He was choosing the darkness. He was locking himself in his tower of grief and fear, while they stood outside, patiently, steadfastly, holding a light for him. He had been so afraid of the storm that he had pushed away his only shelter, his only hope of seeing the sun again. He had to get them back. He didn't call. He couldn't trust his voice not to break. He drove, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He drove away from the cold marble of his neighborhood and toward the modest, tree-lined streets where Clara lived. He pulled up outside her small apartment building, the place he had only ever dropped her off at the curb. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind racing. What would he say? How could he possibly explain the cowardice that had led him to hurt her so deeply? He reached her door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the simple wooden panel. He could hear the faint, melodic sound of her voice from inside. She was reading. He knocked. The voice stopped. He heard soft footsteps, and then the door opened. Clara stood there, her eyes wide with surprise. Behind her, he could see Leo sitting on the floor, surrounded by books, looking up at him with a serious, questioning expression. Julian, she breathed, his name a question and a statement all at once. The hurt was plain to see in her eyes, a shadow over their usual warmth. Clara, can I come in? He asked, his voice raw. She hesitated for only a second before stepping back, holding the door open for him. He stepped inside, into the warmth and clutter of her small, love-filled home. It was so different from his own sterile mansion. Books were stacked everywhere, Leo's drawings were taped to the walls, and a half-finished puzzle was laid out on the coffee table. It was a space that was truly lived in. He turned to face her, the apology he had rehearsed 1,000 times on the drive over vanishing from his mind. All he had left was the raw, unvarnished truth. I am so sorry, he began, the words tumbling out. What I did, it was unforgivable. I was a coward. I saw those people looking at you, at us, and I panicked. I thought my world was toxic, and that I was poisoning you and Leo just by being near you. I thought I was protecting you by pushing you away. He took a step closer, his gaze pleading. But I was wrong. I wasn't protecting you. I was hurting you. I was hurting Lily. I was sentencing myself to the same loneliness I was so desperate to escape. That drawing, Leo's drawing, it made me see. I've been hiding in a tower of my own making. He reached out, taking her hands in his. They were trembling slightly. I don't want to hide anymore, Clara. I don't want to be alone. The past few months with you, with Leo, it's been the only time I've felt alive since the collapse. You didn't just let the light in. You are the light. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't pull her hands away. I want to build a home with you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not a house of marble and glass, but a real home. With you, and Leo, and Lily. If you'll have me. If you can forgive me. Clara looked from his face to her brother, who was watching them with an unnerving wisdom in his young eyes. She looked back at Julian, at the vulnerability and raw honesty shining in his gaze. She saw the man she had come to care for so deeply, stripped of his wealth and his pain, offering her the only thing he had left that truly mattered, his heart. She squeezed his hands. There's nothing to forgive, she whispered. A few weeks later, a press conference was called. New evidence had been uncovered, encrypted emails, offshore bank accounts. The truth had finally surfaced. Richard, his former partner, had conspired with a materials supplier to use substandard steel in the tower's construction, pocketing millions. He had fabricated the design flaw narrative and framed Julian to cover his own crime. Julian Vance was not a suspect. He was a victim, just like everyone else who had lost someone that day. He was exonerated, completely and publicly. He stood at the podium, a forest of microphones before him, cameras flashing like lightning. He delivered his statement, his voice clear and steady. He spoke of his relief, of his gratitude for the investigators, of his enduring grief for his wife and the others who had been lost. But then he went off script. Vindication is not the same as healing, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of reporters. For the past year, I have been living in a gray world. But healing comes in unexpected ways. It comes from kindness when you least deserve it, and from a light that finds you in the dark. He turned and gestured to the side of the stage. I would like you to meet my family. Clara stepped out from the wings, holding Leo's hand. Lily was on her other side, her small hand tucked securely in Clara's. They walked to the podium to stand beside him. A murmur went through the crowd. Julian put his arm around Clara, drawing her close. He rested his other hand on Lily's shoulder. This is Clara May and her brother Leo. They, along with my daughter, are the people who stood by me, who taught me how to live again, and who are helping me build a new foundation. They are my future. He stood there, facing the world, no longer a man alone in his grief, but the cornerstone of a new, unconventional, and deeply loved family. The camera flashes continued, but they no longer felt like an attack. They felt like the dawn of a new day. A year later, the Oak Haven Public Library was just as quiet and reverent as ever. The sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. But in the children's section, the world was alive with color and sound. Julian sat on the brightly colored rug, his back against a low bookshelf. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a soft sweater and comfortable jeans. He held a picture book open, its pages filled with illustrations of whimsical animals. And so, the little bear said, the moon is the best friend you can have, because he is always there. Even when you can't see him, he finished the story, his voice soft and warm. Lily was curled up at his side, her head resting on his lap, her expression content. Across from them, Leo was lying on his stomach, his chin propped up in his hands, his dark eyes wide with concentration as he listened to the story. He looked from the book to Julian's face, a small smile playing on his lips. Clara watched them from a nearby armchair, a book resting unread in her lap. Her heart felt so full it might burst. The cold, haunted man she had met in this very room a year ago was gone. In his place was this man, warm, present, and openly affectionate. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home, filled with Leo's art, the scent of her baking, and the constant, joyful noise of two children who had found a sibling in each other. Julian closed the book and looked over at Clara, his smile reaching his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that she loved. He had found his way back. They had found their way to each other. Leo pushed himself up into a sitting position. He looked directly at Julian, his expression serious. He opened his mouth, and a small, clear voice, unused but steady, filled the quiet space. Can you read it again, Daddy Julian? The world seemed to stop for a moment. Julian's eyes widened, then filled with a sudden, brilliant sheen of tears. He looked at Clara, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. She brought a hand to her mouth, her own tears beginning to fall. It was the first full sentence she had ever heard her brother speak. Julian turned back to the small boy, his smile impossibly tender. He reached out and gently ruffled Leo's hair. Of course, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll read it to you as many times as you want. He opened the book again. In the quiet sanctuary of the library, surrounded by stories of every kind, they had finally finished writing the first chapter of their own. It was a story built not on grand designs or sweeping gestures, but on the quiet, sturdy foundations of a shared silence, a child's drawing, and the simple, profound courage to let the light in. They were no longer four broken pieces. They were a family, found and whole. They were home.